starting module 2, parts 1 and 2 today. And we have 2 different homework assignments due tonight. We have this module 1 follow-up homework, which is really quick. It basically is like, hey, have you been doing the correct things, like the discussion post that we had last week, and if you had any questions on the exam, have you asked your instructor, that sort of stuff. And then we also have mod 2 part 0. What is part 0? Because we don't really do a whole lot of part 0 in the workbooks. Well, every time we start a new module, there's always a part 0 that really isn't fully connected with the rest of the workbook, but it's some sort of important idea that shows up enough in the module that we just want you to practice a little bit before we start the actual questions for the module. And in this case, we are looking at foreign exchange. So the part 0 stuff is on unit conversions, like feet to inches, that sort of thing. And it's fairly simple for the most part. It's multiplication or division, but it is very easy to mess up. So it's just a quick assignment. Looks like this. So, practice this stuff. Like here's a conversion rate. Well, I can't highlight. And we want you to convert that many gallons to liters and so on and so forth. So don't forget about these 2 assignments that are due tonight. So now, if you haven't done so already, go into Canvas and click on this first module 2 link and download the PDF. You should have also received the spreadsheet over email last week. And let's take a look at those 2 things. So like I mentioned a second ago, module 2 is all about foreign exchange. So we are practicing a whole bunch of stuff about converting from one currency to another. There's a few pieces of information here that I'll get to in a second, but today we're primarily working on part 1 and part 2. Part 1 is pretty much just converting some numbers that are given to you on the spreadsheet. I'll show you that in a second. Part 2 has to do with percent change. Like what if these numbers were 10% worse or 15% worse or better, so on and so forth. There's a fairly simple formula for that. I do want to see if you can figure it out on your own, but I'll go over that eventually, maybe not today though. So that's the workbook. We're working on parts 1 and 2. Let's take a look at the spreadsheet. Spreadsheet looks like this. Well, once you go to the correct tab, I think, again, whoever saved it, it's saved on the final tab. So make sure you go all the way left. The expenses tab, which has this information, is what we're going to be utilizing for parts 1 and 2. Basically, what happened here is we took a vacation. We went to these 3 countries, and we wrote down our expenses in terms of lodging, food, and miscellaneous. And we wrote down how much it cost in the local currency. So this is all in euros. This is all in INR, this is all in CNY. Here's the exchange rates at the time of our trip. And one of the things we're going to do is convert all this to US dollars so that we can actually compare these numbers. The next tab is later, like I think this is part 4. And then finally, I think the final tab is for part 5. We'll get there eventually. So what do I actually want to talk about? I want to show you how I would suggest answering some of these questions in the workbook. And as you go through these questions and you see that, yeah, it's primarily unit conversion, it is actually probably easier to do a lot of this in pencil and paper, but I'm going to suggest you don't do that. And the reason why is eventually you're not going to have a choice. You're going to have to use Excel because there's going to be several thousand computations, and you simply can't do that with pencil and paper. So while the math is easy, let's practice Excel, even though that's awkward. So we have this one awkward thing, even though the math is easy. That way, we don't get to some module down the road where the math is hard and you have no idea how to use Excel. And so now you're juggling 2 things. So just try to answer some of these questions in Excel. It will be very awkward at first, but we're going to give it a shot. And here's just some suggestions to use. So, oh, before I do that, let's talk about exchange rates. Sometimes I'll go over the part 0 stuff, but not always. Here's a few tips to think about when you're thinking about these unit conversions. First of all, I want to talk about how to read something like this. So when you see something like 1.1567 USD/EUR, how we are going to read that is as follows. We're going to read that as 1.1567, the first unit, USD, per 1 EUR. So when you see this slash, always sort of imagine there's a 1 after it, which is what I would consider to be the natural way to read this, because if you have like 60 miles per hour, it's 60 miles per 1 hour. Okay, why do I need to point this out? Well, if you Google this, some people do the opposite, which is extremely frustrating. It's a thing with foreign exchange. And I don't know why they do it that way, since every other unit thing I've ever seen with a ratio is always this way. But this is how we are reading it. Whatever follows the slash has the 1. Now, next thing I want to point out is if you do need to use some pencil and paper, which is fine as long as you try Excel eventually, here's how I would suggest figuring out how to do the conversions. When you have something like this, 1.1567 USD per 1 euro, you can write it as a fraction where either the 1 euro is on bottom or the 1 euro is on top. Now, why does this matter? Well, let's say you have this problem here where you're converting 15 USD per euro. How I would suggest doing this, if you can't see it in your head, is on a pencil and paper, write down what they have as a fraction with a 1 underneath it. And then you're either going to multiply by one of these. And by looking at the units, you can always figure out which one's correct. So if I multiply by the first fraction, I have that. If I multiply it by the second fraction, I have that. Why is this useful? Well, if you compare the units, if I have USD on top over on the left option, it's not going to cancel because they're both on top. So that tells me this is wrong. On the other hand, if I write it this way and I write out the USD on bottom, I can tell that I've done it correct because the USD both cancel. And so I know that the answer in this case is 15 divided by this conversion rate. It's just a way to utilize the units to help you figure out how to answer this question. And even better, if you want, these would be the steps that I would do it as. Write down what you have, write down the units that have to be there, then fill in the remaining units. And now you know where the units go. Well, this number always goes next to the top guy, and a 1 always goes next to the one after the slash. So then you fill in the numbers and you do the arithmetic. So if you're struggling with whether or not you should multiply or divide, go ahead and use pencil and paper a few times until it becomes more natural. What else? Okay, now moving to Excel. How should we start doing our work in Excel? There's a lot of tips I want to point out. Here's sort of the first one. Let's say we are converting this number here, lodging using this exchange rate. Here's what I would suggest you do not do. Do not just write the numbers out as you're figuring out these problems. A few different things can arise when you do this. For one, this isn't actually the exchange rate, even though it looks like it is. Sometimes, if I click on this, there's actually more numbers there and they're being rounded and you just might not notice that. And so you might round on accident and then you're off by a penny, whole problem's wrong. Another thing that can happen, if you're just going to write this out, it's extremely easy to make typos. I've reversed the order of 2 of these digits. I don't even remember which 2, but another thing that can happen. So first thing I'm going to point out is try to use references as much as you can. It's just a safer way to utilize Excel. You will never have rounding mistakes if you do it this way. Next thing I want to point out as you're working through this, don't just write randomly all over your spreadsheet. The whole point of this is maybe a question you're working on in part one shows up on the test in a week. This isn't helpful to me. If I open this up in a week, I have no idea what I was doing. Well, maybe you have a better memory than me, but this isn't super helpful. So try to do your work in a way that if you came back to it, you'd be like, oh yeah, that's what I did for this question, and that's why. So what are some things you can do instead of just writing out the arithmetic? Well, you could throw on some labels. So like maybe at minimum you throw what question you're on, or maybe you actually write out the question. These are all just suggestions. You don't have to do any of this, but this can make it easier to read when you come back to it. Remember, this is your notes. Do what is helpful to you. Another thing you can do is you don't actually need to write out questions if you use really good labels. So for instance, let's say I have all this stuff, which you do, and I know I need to convert this. Why not just borrow the layout of this really nicely formed table for my answers? Now I've converted everything to USD and I've used the same columns and the same rows. It's just really easy to compare this to this, where now all my numbers are in terms of USD. This is a suggestion. Okay, another thing worth pointing out, let's say you want units in your work. Units are very important because right here on this page, there's 4 different units. We got euros, INR, CNY, and USD. Well, if you would like to put units next to your work, good idea, by the way, put them in the next cell. Like here, it's 1 cell over. And the reason why is if you put them in the same cell, this cell is now sort of ruined because you can't reference it anymore. If you try to reference this thing and do like ×2, it just breaks. Excel is confused by those words. So just throw them in the next cell over. Another thing you can do is utilize what I like to call input cells. So let's say you have this question. You have 50 CNY, convert that to USD. Okay, well, what did Jacob say a few minutes ago? I should use references. Well, where's my 50? I have nowhere to reference it. You might think, okay, well, there's nowhere to reference. I'll just type it in. Yeah, that works. But in my opinion, this is better. Just type it into its own cell, and then in your work, reference it. And this is not only this easier to read than just this, because I can see what's going on here. I took this and changed it to that. But let's say this shows up on the homework for part 1, except that it's 60 CNY. I just changed this, hit enter, and it updates. It's much nicer to have these sort of external input cells where the answers are based on those guys. What else we got in here I wanted to suggest? Okay, let's go back to this example here. So one thing I suggested maybe doing, if I was going to convert all this stuff, I suggested borrowing the layout. Now this isn't bad. It's fairly nice to read, but you could do more. And most of the time I will go a step further. Let's say you build this, and this next step I'm going to show you, I would always do this at the very end because you don't want to have to continually have to manipulate this. Well, on the top ribbon of Excel, there's a whole bunch of tabs. It usually starts on this one called the Home tab. And on the Home tab, there's these 2 buttons here that I've sort of zoomed in on that are really useful when you're trying to organize your work. And this one on the left allows us to throw borders around stuff, and this one on the right allows us to color in some stuff. And that, if we utilize them, allows us to do things like this. So like instead of just having all this black and white, which if you have multiple pages of just black and white stuff, your eyes start bleeding trying to read this stuff. You start throwing things like this on it, it's just easier to focus in on your work when you come back to it. And if you want, you could even throw that around like the initial stuff that's given to you. There's nothing that says you can't adjust what was given to you at the top. And now compare these 2 things. So you come back to this in a week versus this in a week. It's just easier to read. Now, like I said, it is overkill and it does take more time, but it's just good to practice this stuff when you have that extra time, as opposed to when you have pages and pages and stuff and you forget how to do this stuff later on. One last thing I want to talk about, kind of two actually. Let's say you're doing some work in part one and you do this conversion. That's great. You get this answer. Okay, but you go on the homework and the homework only wants 2 decimal places. Well, you could round this in your head. Most of us can do that great, but you do this 100 times, you're gonna mess it up eventually. So the safer way is to have Excel around it. And what we're gonna do is, once again on the home tab, use these buttons. So I'm gonna actually click them over here. You can either make more decimal places or less. And it doesn't actually forget any of those numbers. Those numbers are still there. It just rounds it for you and makes it easier to read. So this is something to think about. So you don't have 10 decimal numbers everywhere. And the other thing is the style that your work is presented in. So like, let's say I want to do 1 divided by 2 for some reason. I get 0.5, but I actually wanted this as a percent. Well, this button here, which is right above the last two that we just looked at, gives us a whole bunch of different options, one of which is percentage. It's just maybe I wanted to present it that way. So if it's not being displayed how you would like it to, it's typically one of those buttons there that'll allow you to change it.